In my video this week, I'll be showing you how I assemble one of my teapots from the wheel thrown components. This process begins with the body and the lid. Both parts are perfectly leather hard, but the lid doesn't quite fit perfectly, so I begin by centering that, and I'll trim away some of the excess from this until the body fits just right. Once spinning in the middle, I secure it in place with 3 lumps of soft clay, and whilst I'm here, together with trimming the lid to fit, I also neaten up certain parts of it. Although the part I need to trim to make it fit is this horizontal flange, which I only take a thin slither off, as when I tested its fit just a few moments earlier, it didn't need much material to be removed. To make the lid lighter, I'll also trim some clay away from the inside of the lid, although I need to be careful not to go too thin here, as there has to be material left on the opposite side, which I can refine later on when I trim the top of the lid. I then offer the body of the teapot up to the lid to see if it fits, which it does, but if it didn't, I can simply leave the lid in place and trim just a touch more away from that locating flange until I get it spot on. I then wet the wheel head and place the teapot body onto it, tap centering it and letting the water help stick the pot to the wheel. I've made this shape before, although in this case I've made the shape slightly shorter and wider compared to previous iterations, with a step in the form around the waist on which the glaze I coat this with should interact nicely on by pulling on the ledge itself and breaking sharply over it. But for now I'll continue trimming the body, which is essentially just the process of refining the shape and thinning the walls to make the pot lighter. I use a variety of sharp tungsten carbide turning tools for this process, and once the different sections have been trimmed, I usually scrape over them with a sharp metal edge, as this leaves a neater surface. I typically work from bottom to top, although there's no one way of doing it. On this section I can place the fingers of my left hand opposite the area I'm trimming, on the inside of the pot, which is really helpful as I can easily gauge the thickness of the walls. Typically speaking, you want the walls and the base of your pot to be as even in thickness as possible, as this way the clay will all dry out at the same rate and there's less of a chance that things will crack as they dry, which for teapots, with so many different components being attached to the body, makes it even more important. To trim the lid I simply place it in situ whilst using a spinner placed on top of it to push down with to keep it securely in place, and even when the spinner has been removed, the fingers of my left hand here are more or less doing the exact same job, pushing lightly on the clay, as there is always the chance that the lid might leap up as the tool is pressed against it if there's nothing keeping it pinned down in place. As for the shape of the top of the lid, I trim it so it's just ever so slightly concave, and once I've removed enough material from it, I'll give the top a quick burnish which compresses any sharp specks of sand back into the clay body. Then, using a hole piercer, I create a hole in the very centre of the top of the lid. This way, as the lid fits so tightly, when the vessel is poured with liquid inside of it, it won't glug or sputter as the vessel pulls air through it as the liquid pours out. I then spend a brief moment making sure both the entry and exit wounds are clean, as pushing the piercer through the stoneware always creates a few burrs of untidy clay around the hole itself. There's still the base of the teapot to trim, so I detach the vessel using a sharp metal edge, clean off the wheel head so nothing can embed itself back into the lid of the teapot, and now as the lid fits so nicely, I can use the lid as a chuck for the teapot body, which makes trimming a vessel like this, which has quite a narrow opening, much easier. Once again, I secure the lid in place with 3 lumps of soft clay. This way the lid doesn't skid off centre as I'm turning the top. As the base is quite wide and thin, in this case the spinner distributes that downward pressure so I don't accidentally deform the base like it might if I just use my fingertips. Think of standing on thin ice as opposed to lying down across it. I switched tools here as I felt I needed something sharper that would really bite and tear the clay away without having to push down with too much pressure, as that might cause the pot to topple over to one side. And with the spinner removed, I can begin work on the actual base of the pot itself. And to check its thickness, I just push down lightly with my thumb to see if there's any movement in that expanse of clay, which there wasn't. It felt quite sturdy, so I switched to a sharper tool and trimmed a bit more aggressively. And in this instance, I ended up removing much more than I thought I might, which means I should have made it thinner during the throwing stage, but no matter, doing it this way works just as well. It just takes a bit longer. And I then stamp the body with my maker's mark. And finally, with the lid underneath, I just tidy up the surfaces, as they were very lightly marked from being placed atop the pot and turned in situ. And as I won't be glazing these areas, I want the clay work itself to be really neat and tidy, as there won't be anything hiding it. With the lid and body now turned, I can begin the process of attaching the spout. I made the spout after the other two components, but I covered it overnight as it dried. This way the clay remains quite soft and is very easy to blend into the body of the teapot. I slice away much of the excess on the lowest portion of the spout at roughly a 45-degree angle. It's offered up to the teapot to see if it fits, and if needs be, I'll continue cutting more clay away from the spout until it's protruding from the teapot in the correct way and proportionally feels right. I don't want it to appear too heavy and cumbersome next to the teapot body, nor can it be too small. And the general rule is that the spout should be projecting upwards at about a 45-degree angle, and that the tip of the spout should be level to at least the gallery of the teapot. This way the vessel can be filled up entirely with tea without it leaking out prematurely, like it can do if the spout is positioned poorly, say if it's attached protruding horizontally from the vessel. I then insert a wetted sponge on a stick into the spout and twist it around to smooth over any of the marks left from my knife as I carved it to the right shape. It's then lightly stuck to the teapot body, which is easy to do as the spout is so soft. Once tacked on, I score around the spout, just a simple line so I know where to pierce the holes into the body. I then take a slightly larger hole piercer than I used for doing the lid, and I make a series of holes into the body. As I push the metal through, I brace the other side of the wall with my fingertips, just to stop this portion of the wall from bowing inwards with the pressure. If the walls are really moving as you do this, or the small bridges between the holes are breaking as you create new ones, then the clay is either too soft or too thin to be doing this, and in both cases you have to wait for the clay to dry out. I do this entirely by eye, but you can make and use a guide so you know exactly where to pierce the holes if you want. But I've always found it quite easy to do by hand, and truth be told, I don't mind if they're a little bit skew-whiff, as long as the holes are neat and tidy. I lightly scrape over them to remove any excess clay, and then I use the wooden handle of one of my potter's needles, which I insert into each hole and rotate it in place a few times as I push in. This makes each hole lovely and round, and smooths these pierced holes, so hopefully there's less debris for glaze to stick on, and thereafter the tea leaves themselves. The spout is then placed into a shallow bowl of water, just for a few moments, but really it depends on how firm your spout is. If it's very leather hard, I might leave it in there for 5 to 10 minutes, so the clay becomes very soft, and is therefore easier to attach to the body. But in this case, as the spout was already quite soft, I only left it in there for the duration of the time it took me to score and slip around these pierced holes. Doing this softens up the area onto which the spout is going to be attached, all of which is done with the hope of preventing cracks from forming around the join of the spout. I then gently stick it on and make sure that the holes inside line up with the spout. As the clay is so soft, it can also be tilted up if needs be. And once I'm happy with its position, I can begin blending the soft clay into the body, which I initially do with my fingertips mainly, smearing it in all the way around. Once the shape is roughly there, I'll fettle all the way around the spout with a sponge on a stick, making the join as flush as possible to the body. You may find if you do this with a slightly coarse clay body that whilst you'll make the shape how you want it, the clay's surface will become rough, as the clay itself is ground away, leaving the specks of sand more prominent. You can see that here if you look at the spout, in comparison to the rest of the body. So to fix that, I use the curved sides of one of the metal hole piercers to burnish the surface and compress in some of those sharper specks. This makes all the difference, and if I didn't do this, they might interfere with the glazes I end up coating over it. With the spout now attached, all that's left is to attach and pull the handle. And just like attaching the spout, I begin by scoring and slipping an area directly opposite the spout on the other side. I then dab a small amount of slip onto these scratches and take one of the handle blanks I'd previously pulled and tap out one end of it to create a flared section of clay. This is then firmly pushed against the body with 2 fingers placed inside opposite where I'm pushing to brace the wall. Once firmly attached, I'll blend in that flared portion of clay into the teapot body so it joins nice and flush, like the spout. I like both the spout and the handle of my teapots to occupy a similar amount of space either side of the vessel, whilst also having matching visual strength, and so in this instance, if I made the handle too large or too small in comparison to the spout, then proportionally there'd be some kind of mismatch between the two, which would end up making the entire pot feel clumsy. Once the handle is firmly attached to the body, I use a soaked hand to thin and refine that length of clay and finally arch it down and join it back onto the body of the teapot. I make sure I pull either side of the handle using the same profile of my hand. This way the cross section remains nice and oval as opposed to the handle potentially having a thicker and a thin side, which can happen if they're pulled unevenly. The trickiest thing here is holding the teapot, as I can't hold it near the spout without potentially damaging it, so it can feel a bit awkward pulling these handles as compared to the ones I pull on my mugs. To get the last of the weight out of the top of the handle, I use the tip of my thumb to score 3 grooves into the back of the length. This refines it just a bit more, whilst creating 3 channels into which the glaze will be able to pool nicely. And once I'm finally happy with the length, I have to change the position of my left hand. I then take the end of the handle and gently lower it into place, while simultaneously rotating the teapot itself. And as it wasn't perfectly straight or in line with the spout, I gently flick it to one side until the two align, and only then will I begin blending in the bottom join into the body of the teapot. Once the bottom join has been smoothed in, I can carefully make some adjustments to the handle, in this instance making it kick up just a bit more so that the top portion has a nicer curve to it. A few moments later, I also used a sponge on a stick just to smooth over the worst of the making marks. And once fettled, I burnish in those coarse specks of sand. Although at this point, I felt like both the handle and the spout were just a touch too heavy for the form, so the following day I'll spend some time just going over the spout and handle with a knife and a sponge on a stick to make them a bit more petite. Otherwise, I really like this squat version of the teapot. It has a slightly wider, thinner lid, and I think once refined just a touch more, it'll really work. The last thing I'll do today though is dry it upside down. This way the handle can't sag and lose its shape as it dries overnight. I'll also wrap them in plastic so they don't dry out too quickly. The following morning, both the spout and handle are as leather hard as the body, and I spent probably too much time, I think about 20 minutes, just refining both appendages. And although the difference really is subtle, visually both appear just a touch lighter, and I made the curve on the inside of the handle have more of a natural flow to it. And these are all the teapots I made in this batch. All are slightly different, but they're sharp and angular, and hopefully they feel as if they belong in the same family. And I think my favourite from this batch is the second teapot to the right, but I'd also love to hear what you think, so please let me know in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this teapot assembly video, and thank you, as always, for taking the time to watch. I hope you realise just how much your viewership for my films here on YouTube help fund my studio and keep things ticking along, and so I'm eternally grateful for those of you who take the time to watch these in their entirety. I'm very lucky. And, as always, I'll see you next week.